Welcome to HFY Galactic Audiobooks, your ultimate destination for heart-pounding sci-fi thrillers and mind-bending alien adventures. If you're someone who loves epic battles, mysterious alien encounters, and stories that make you question everything, then you've come to the right place. Our tales will transport you to distant worlds, filled with danger, mystery, and the thrill of the unknown. So sit back, relax, and join us on a journey through the stars as we explore the secrets of the universe. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more sci-fi thrills and alien escapades. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The storm outside howled like a beast trapped in the throes of madness. It was no mere blizzard, it was a wrathful force, a merciless entity with no regard for life or shelter. The wind tore through the darkened streets of Nocturne, its shrill wails reverberating through the empty city like the cries of a ghost lost in time. The storm had been relentless, a swirling tempest of ice and snow that seemed to smother the world with every passing moment. The once vibrant streets of the city had become unrecognizable, choked beneath a thick, suffocating blanket of white. Not a single sound save for the eerie howls of the wind and the occasional pop of malfunctioning machinery broke the unnatural silence. Even the surveillance drones, ever watchful and omnipresent, had been swallowed by the storm's fury, their once steady hums silenced as though the world itself had closed its eyes. Amidst the chaos, a lone figure staggered through the white expanse. Her form, barely visible through the dense, swirling snow, was a mere shadow one with the storm. She stumbled, feet numb and unsteady, her steps uncertain as if the earth beneath her had turned to ice. Her bare feet left no trace, no mark upon the frozen ground swallowed by the storm's wrath as quickly as they were made. She was but a fleeting presence, a fragile flicker in the endless white, as though even the world itself was doing everything it could to erase her existence. An alien, a being far removed from this world, was wrapped in tattered cloth, her body trembling violently beneath the cold. The fabrics she wore were more a desperate attempt at survival than anything offering warmth. Her skin, once a rich and vibrant green, was now dull and tinged by frostbite, the markings of her people now barely visible against the deadly freeze. They had once been proud, intricate symbols of her species, the Valerie race known for their wisdom, grace, and unity. But now, they were but faint echoes of a past she could barely remember, eaten away by the cold that had claimed so much of her. Her journey had once been one of importance, of power. As a diplomat, she had stood before the most influential beings, negotiating peace between warring planets, calming the storms of intergalactic conflict. She had been a voice, a force of reason, a bridge between civilizations. But now, that was all gone, cast aside, forgotten. Now, she was nothing more than a castaway on an alien world, abandoned and left to die in a city that seemed to have forgotten warmth. Exiled, without a title or a name, her presence was no longer desired. Her breath came in shallow, painful gasps, her body no longer able to keep up with the world around her. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed, falling into the deep snow. The cold gripped her like iron chains, squeezing the last remnants of strength from her body. As her vision blurred, she saw a flicker of light through the storm's veil. A small building, a mechanic's shop, standing like a quiet sentinel against the storm's wrath. The light that seeped through the cracks in the walls offered her a sliver of hope, something warm, something real in a world gone cold. She had to reach it. Her body shook uncontrollably, her teeth chattering as she forced herself to crawl towards the warmth. Her skin burned from the cold, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. She barely had the strength to whisper, but she did. "I offer my body," she gasped hoarsely, the words almost lost in the wind. "Please, anything. Just let me in." Her voice was a thin thread, barely audible over the howling storm. It was an offer she had made before too many times to count, but never had it been so desperate. She had no pride left. She had no dignity. All she wanted was to survive, to feel warmth again. But as the seconds passed, there was only silence. No lights flickered in the windows. No movement behind the frosted panes. The door remained shut, unyielding. Not a single sound came from within. It was as though the building, like the rest of the city, had turned its back on her. Silence. Absolute silence. The weight of it pressed in on her chest, heavier than the storm itself. The cold wrapped around her like a suffocating cloak, and she realized with a bitter finality that there would be no rescue here. No mercy. No one cared. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the frozen metal of the door. Her tears froze on her cheeks. How many times had she made this offer? How many times had she been cast aside? Her heart, once strong and full of purpose, now felt like a hollow shell, just as cold and abandoned as the world around her. The storm raged on. SRA's body shook violently, the cold seeping into her very bones. Her muscles, stiff and unresponsive, betrayed her as she struggled to remain upright. The weight of the storm was unbearable, like a crushing force that had stolen every ounce of strength she once had. Her hands, numb and frozen, pressed against the cold metal of the door, but it didn't matter. The wind, wild and unforgiving, howled through the cracks in the city, making the walls tremble and the air sharp with icy whispers. The alien's pride had long since been stripped away. She had once walked through halls of power, negotiated peace, and been revered as a symbol of unity. But that was in another life, a life that now seemed like a dream fading into nothingness. The world she had once known had turned its back on her, and now she was just another broken being, stranded in a city where survival was the only thing that mattered. She closed her eyes, and for a brief, fleeting moment, she imagined a world where kindness still existed. A world where someone would reach out, where shelter didn't come with conditions, where warmth didn't have a price. She had made countless offers before, pleaded, begged, offered her very body in exchange for a place to stay. But the answer was always the same: silence, rejection, sometimes even laughter. The cold, harsh laughter that pierced through her soul, telling her she was nothing, a worthless creature. No more. Not again. Her resolve faltered, and she let her head drop, forehead resting against the unforgiving metal. She felt herself slipping, her consciousness fading, slipping into the numbness. It would be easier that way, wouldn't it? To simply let the storm take her. To be swallowed by the endless white, to become just another ghost lost in the snow. But then, the door creaked. It was a sound so faint, so subtle, that it barely cut through the roaring storm. SRA's heart skipped a beat, her ears straining against the wind as she turned her head slowly, her eyes barely able to focus. Through the blurred veil of frost and snow, she saw it, A figure. A silhouette, towering over her, blocking out the faint light from the building. She couldn't make out the details, her vision was clouded with ice, but she could feel his presence. A man. He didn't rush to her side. He didn't shove her in or demand anything. There was no aggression in his movements, no hostility. Instead, he crouched beside her, his shadow falling over her fragile form. His presence was calm, steady. For a moment, she thought she might have imagined it after all. What reason could anyone have to help her now? But no, there he was, real and solid, his outline unwavering against the storm. Without a word, he placed a hand on her shoulder. The touch was gentle, firm, but not forceful. There was no rush, no impatience. He didn't grab her or try to move her with rough hands. He simply touched her, assessing her, as though considering whether to help. SRA's breath hitched, the weight of it pressing down on her chest, as if this single touch, this simple act of kindness was more than she could bear. Her voice cracked, barely above a whisper, but it was enough. "I'll do anything. Please, let me stay." Her words trembled, fragile as the breath escaping her lips, but they were honest. Desperate. The man didn't answer her. He didn't offer empty promises or throw pity her way. He didn't need to speak. Instead, he simply moved slowly and deliberately. He bent down, strong arms gently but securely lifting her as though she were made of fragile glass. He didn't drag her. He didn't treat her as a burden. There was no hurry, no sense of urgency, only quiet care. He carried her like a piece of something broken, but worth saving. The warmth of his body against hers was a stark contrast to the freezing cold that had stolen every bit of heat from her. The sudden shift in temperature made her gasp, her body racked with a violent shiver. She didn't remember the last time she had felt warmth, not true warmth, the kind that soaked into your bones and made you feel human again. The workshop was dark, lit only by the faint glow of an old, flickering light. It smelled of metal, oil, and dust, of a place that had seen years of wear but still held the pulse of life within its walls. The man Darren, she would later learn, moved with quiet efficiency, not hurried, but purposeful. He laid her down on a low cot in the corner of the room. The blanket that he wrapped around her was rough, scratchy, nothing like the soft, comforting blankets she had once known, but to her, it was the most sacred thing she had felt in months. The warmth from the heater above her hummed, a soft and steady sound that seemed to lull the storm outside into silence. Darren didn't rush to question her. He didn't prod for details or demand her history. He didn't press her for answers she wasn't ready to give. He simply left her to rest, his presence a quiet reassurance that she was not alone. As her body finally began to thaw, the tears she hadn't realized she was holding back began to fall. She wasn't sure if they were from relief, exhaustion, or the overwhelming sensation of not being abandoned, of not being alone. For the first time in months, she felt something stir deep inside her, something she had thought she had lost. Hope. And in that moment, despite the strange and cold world outside, SRA knew she had found something more than just a safe place to rest. She had found something she hadn't even known she was searching for: kindness, given freely, without expectation. For the first time in what felt like forever, she was not a burden. She was not just surviving. She was cared for. And that, perhaps, was enough for now. The storm outside still raged, its fury unrelenting. The wind howled through the gaps in the walls, whispering threats of cold and darkness. But inside the small mechanic's workshop, the atmosphere was different. The air was thick with warmth, not just from the low hum of the heat lamp above, but from something deeper, something that seemed to settle into the bones of the place. The storm, fierce and unyielding as it was, could not penetrate the fragile sanctuary Darren had created in his little corner of Nocturne. SRA awoke to the sound of soft clinks and metallic taps. It was a sound so familiar, so comforting, that it made her heart calm. The tools, old, worn, but cared for, clattered gently as Darren moved about, working in quiet rhythm. The faint hum of the machines, some broken, some barely holding together, filled the silence between them. The steady presence beside her was like an anchor, keeping her grounded. She opened her eyes slowly, her limbs still heavy from exhaustion, but there was no pain. There was only the softness of warmth around her. The blanket, though rough and worn, was still wrapped around her shoulders. The room was dim, lit only by the pale, flickering light from a small overhead fixture. The harsh world outside was muffled by the steel walls that surrounded her, but inside, the air was alive with purpose. And in the center of it all, Darren moved methodical, focused, like someone whose very being was entwined with the workshop he had built. SRA watched him for a moment, her eyes tracking his movements. There was something different about him. A quiet understanding in the way he worked, in the way he moved. His hands, rough and calloused from years of labor, never hesitated. Each motion was fluid, deliberate, and unhurried. He didn't rush, nor did he try to make her feel seen or heard. He simply existed in the space, as if his presence alone was enough. He didn't ask her for anything. He didn't pry into her past, didn't ask for her story once she had told too many times, only to be met with indifference or scorn. Here, in this small, forgotten corner of the city, he didn't care about her history, her mistakes, or her fall from grace. He simply accepted her. And that, in itself, was a kind of mercy she had never known. The days passed slowly, the hours blending into each other like shadows at dusk. But in that gentle passing of time, something changed. It wasn't a grand revelation, nor a dramatic turning point. It was the quiet accumulation of trust. Trust built on actions, not words. Trust earned with each glance shared, each moment spent side by side without expectation. As Darren worked, SRA found herself drawn into the rhythm of his life. She had been many things in her time: diplomat, negotiator, advisor, but here, in the workshop with Darren, she was something simpler. She was a worker, a companion, an equal. Slowly, cautiously, she began to offer what little she had left. Her knowledge, her understanding of machines, her ability to repair and build things she had once taken for granted, now became her gift to him. Her hands, though stiff from the cold and the wear of exile, began to move with purpose. She would sit at his side, guiding the broken circuits, connecting wires, carefully aligning parts that had long been forgotten by others. The process was slow, the work painstaking, but there was something healing in it. Each repaired part, each machine brought back to life, was a small victory. not just for the work itself, but for the bond that was growing between them. There were no words spoken between them, not many. The silence was not oppressive, it was not the kind of silence that gnawed at the soul, making one feel small or insignificant. It was the silence of shared understanding. In the quiet of the workshop, there was no need for conversation. Their movements spoke for them. SRA could feel the unspoken connection between them, a bond forged not out of pity, not out of charity, but out of something deeper, something quiet, something fragile, yet strong. It was trust, quiet and unwavering. Trust that didn't require promises or overt declarations. It was a trust that had been built over the course of days, not with grand gestures, but with simple acts of kindness. With a shared meal. With the sound of tools clinking together in the stillness. With the warmth of one soul reaching out to another, not to save them, but to let them simply be. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, SRA didn't feel alone. She didn't feel like she was begging for scraps, fighting for survival. She didn't need to offer herself anymore because here, in the heart of this small, forgotten workshop, there was something she hadn't felt in a long time: respect. Not for her position, her title, or her status, but for who she was in this moment. A broken being, yes, but not beyond repair. Not beyond redemption. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full, filled with the soft hum of machines, the rustling of tools, the steady beat of time passing. And in that silence, trust grew. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was just there, like the quiet pulse of life itself. SRA didn't know what the future held, whether the storm outside would ever stop, or whether she would ever be truly free of her past. But for the first time in months, she felt like she could face it. She felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was living again. And that, in itself, was something worth holding on to. The night had fallen heavy and quiet, the storm outside now a distant, almost forgotten rumble in the background. The warmth inside the workshop still clung to the air, though the threat outside grew more tangible with each passing moment. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was charged, thick with tension. A stillness that made SRA's senses ache. Every small sound, every footstep, every creak in the floorboards became amplified in the quiet room. She could feel it, the sense that something was coming, something inevitable. Darren had been working late, his face illuminated by the dim glow of his workbench. SRA sat nearby, the steady motion of her hands over the tools beside him her only focus. She had been learning, growing stronger, but tonight was different. Tonight, there was a heaviness in the air, a chill that wasn't caused by the storm. She knew what was coming. A low thud broke the silence, followed by a distant clang. Then another. And another. The door shook as something or someone struck it from the other side. A pulse of cold air rushed in, unsettling the stillness. Darren didn't flinch. His hands didn't hesitate as he tightened the last screw on a broken circuit board. But his eyes, dark and focused, never left the door. SRA's heart quickened. She felt it in her bones. The Valerie had found them. The door groaned under the weight of another strike, louder this time. A flash of fear danced across her chest, but it was quickly replaced by something else. Something deeper, darker. The storm outside may have been merciless, but this was a different kind of storm. It was one that had been building for months, one that would either break them or make them whole. Without a word, Darren stood. His movements were swift, deliberate. He was calm, unnervingly so. His eyes locked with SRA's for a moment, and she saw something flicker there. Not fear. Not hesitation. There was only resolve. And something more, something unspoken. They had reached this point together. And now, they would face whatever came through that door together, too. The first blow hit the door with a force that shook the entire room. The sound was deafening, a thunderous crash that reverberated through the walls, as if the storm outside had come to join the fray. The door splintered, the metal buckling under the weight of the attack. There was no more time for hesitation. Darren moved swiftly, pulling a short-range arc emitter from beneath a workbench. The weapon, sleek and compact, hummed with energy, its blue light flickering like a heartbeat. He glanced back at SRA. "Stay close," he murmured. His voice was steady, but there was an urgency there, a quiet command that needed no further explanation. SRA nodded, her body tense, but her mind clear. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had come too far to be afraid. Not now, not with Darren beside her. Together, they had built something that was worth protecting. The door buckled again, and then, with a loud, final crack, it gave way. The first of the Valerie agents stormed into the room, their dark armored figures moving with terrifying precision. They were quick, coordinated, their faces hidden behind masks that were as cold and emotionless as the storm outside. They had come for her. She could see it in their eyes, their mission, their judgment. But they would not take her. Not without a fight. The battle erupted instantly. Darren moved like lightning, his movements fluid and efficient. The arc emitter crackled as it released a pulse of energy, hitting the lead agent square in the chest. The agent was flung back, crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. But the others were already advancing, their weapons drawn. SRA's heart pounded in her chest, but there was no fear. Only purpose. Her hands, once trembling and uncertain, now moved with a practiced ease. She had fought her battles in the past, but never like this. Not like this. She grabbed the nearest weapon, a makeshift plasma cutter, and swung it towards the second agent, her aim true. The beam of energy sliced through the air, connecting with the agent's shoulder, sending them sprawling to the floor. She didn't wait for them to rise. There was no time. The third agent came at her, swinging a heavy baton with deadly intent. SRA ducked low, narrowly avoiding the blow, and in one swift motion, she used her own body weight to flip the agent over her shoulder, sending them crashing to the ground. The clang of metal against the cold floor echoed through the room. Darren was already on the move again, his focus unshaken. Another pulse from his emitter knocked down the fourth agent, their body falling to the floor in a heap, their weapon clattering out of reach. It was over almost as quickly as it had begun. But the silence that followed the battle was not one of relief. It was the silence of a new understanding. They had done it. They had fought back, not out of anger, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. A necessity born from the realization that this small, battered workshop, this place they had made their own, was more than just a shelter. It was their home. And no one was going to take it from them. As the last of the agents lay unconscious at their feet, Darren turned to SRA. His breath came in shallow gasps, but his eyes were calm, focused. He didn't speak, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the air between them. This battle, this fight, wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about protecting themselves from the Valerie, or even the storm outside. It was about something deeper. It was about the unspoken bond they had formed, about the realization that they were no longer outcasts. They had something now. Something real. Something worth fighting for. They stood together in the aftermath, surrounded by the wreckage of the battle. The storm outside still raged, but inside, the workshop was calm. The warmth of the fire still flickered in the corner, and the air, once thick with tension, now carried a sense of quiet triumph. They had made it. Together. The aftermath of the battle was still heavy in the air. The workshop, once a quiet sanctuary from the storm outside, now stood in chaos, tools scattered across the floor, broken machines, and the harsh scent of ozone hanging in the air. But for all the disarray, there was a new energy in the space. They had defended it. They had defended home. Darren stood still in the center of the room, wiping the sweat from his brow. His eyes flickered over the unconscious bodies of the Valerie agents, his movements slow but deliberate. He didn't seem disturbed by the violence. There was only focus on the task ahead. The storm outside continued to pound against the walls, but the storm inside the workshop had subsided. They had fought. And they had won. SRA, still breathing heavily from the fight, looked around the room. The once familiar hum of the workshop, now still and quiet, almost felt alien. The walls, once the boundary between warmth and cold, had become the site of something new, something raw. There was a weight to the silence now, not of fear, but of something more profound. She glanced at Darren, his face unreadable. His stance was calm, steady, but there was something flickering in his eyes, something that was more than just the thrill of survival. It was realization. They had crossed a threshold. No longer outcasts, no longer victims of fate, but active participants in the life they were carving out for themselves. Are they dead? SRA asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. The Valerie agents, though incapacitated, were far from dead. They would awaken, eventually wounded but alive, and they would remember this night. No, Darren replied, his voice steady. They'll wake, but they won't be a threat anymore. Not to us. SRA nodded. It wasn't about their survival, not anymore. They had fought for something bigger than that. They had fought for their right to exist without fear. To live on their own terms, without the looming shadow of the Valerie Empire. But the reality of their victory came with its own cost. The Valerie would not let this slide. The message was clear. Tonight's events wouldn't be ignored. The empire that had cast SRA aside would retaliate. It was only a matter of time. A deep, uncomfortable silence settled between them, thick with the weight of what came next. SRA could feel it, knew it, in the way the air felt colder now, in the way the storm seemed to grow louder, angrier. The battle had not been just for survival. It was a declaration. They had made their stand. And yet, with that stand came the understanding that it was not over. The Valerie would not stop. And they, Darren and SRA, would have to be ready to face whatever came next. But even in the face of uncertainty, something shifted inside her. There was no turning back now. Her heart, once cold and shattered, now beat with a new sense of purpose. She had a partner. A companion. Darren had stood beside her not out of duty, but because he believed in something bigger than either of them. He believed in her. And that belief gave her the strength to continue. "We can't stay here," SRA said, her voice barely above a whisper, but steady. Darren didn't need to ask why. He understood. "You're right," he said, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage of the workshop, the place that had, until now, been their safe haven. "We need to move." The realization was sudden, but undeniable. This place, this small sanctuary, was no longer safe. The Valerie would come back, perhaps with more force, perhaps with a different approach. But they would come. And they couldn't afford to wait for that to happen. SRA turned toward the corner of the room, where a small panel sat hidden beneath an old workbench. She had never used it, but she had seen Darren fiddle with it once or twice. It was a small, unassuming control panel, connected to old systems that had been discarded long ago. "We need to go," she repeated, more to herself than to Darren. The storm outside would be their cover, for now. It was their only chance to slip away without being tracked, to disappear into the desolation beyond the city. Darren moved toward her, his steps measured but sure. He had already begun packing their few belongings, tools, provisions, and anything that might be useful for what lay ahead. The city had already forgotten them once. It would do so again, but they could not remain here forever. "I'll reroute the systems," Darren said, his fingers flying over the panel, the hum of machinery filling the room once more. SRA watched him for a moment. He wasn't afraid, wasn't rushing. He had accepted the change, had accepted their fate. She felt a surge of something warm, something steady. It was the trust they had built, the bond that held them together now. "You're not alone," Darren added, his voice quiet but certain. "We'll figure this out. Together." The words, simple but profound, settled deep within her. They weren't alone anymore. This was no longer about mere survival. It was about finding a way to thrive, to carve out a space in a world that had tried to erase them. The workshop, once their refuge, was no longer a home. But the place where they stood, the life they were building, that was their home. And they would defend it. Not just with weapons, but with every ounce of their being. SRA turned to face Darren, meeting his eyes. In that brief moment, there was no need for words. They had already made their decision. It was time to move. The quiet that followed the battle seemed to press in from all sides, thick and suffocating. The workshop, once filled with the hum of machines and the clink of tools, now stood still, like a place frozen in time. SRA and Darren moved with purpose, packing the remnants of their life into hastily gathered bags, not knowing what lay ahead but certain that they could no longer stay. The storm outside had become their only ally, its fury concealing their escape. As they moved through the snow, the world around them seemed to fall away, the weight of the Valerie threat fading with each step they took. Their footprints were quickly swallowed by the relentless winds, leaving no trace of their passing. They were no longer the hunted, they were the hunters now, running not from the storm, but toward something far more elusive. Their journey was long and grueling. They crossed vast stretches of frozen wasteland, the icy wind cutting through their clothes, numbing their bodies but never their resolve. They slept in abandoned colonies, once teeming with life, now reduced to broken remnants of what had been. The air in these places was thick with dust, the buildings silent and hollow, as though the very earth itself had turned its back on them. But they kept moving. With each station they passed, with each desolate outpost they encountered, they grew more determined. They were no longer fleeing the shadows of their past, they were forging a path toward a future they could build together. Their bond, forged in the heat of battle and tempered by their shared solitude, was stronger than anything the world could throw at them. They found shelter in the most unlikely places, forgotten bunkers, makeshift camps in the ruins of long-abandoned cities, hidden pockets of warmth in the coldest corners of the galaxy. And yet, despite the desolation around them, there was something unspoken that kept them moving forward. The warmth between them wasn't just from the fires they built or the shelters they created. It was the warmth of hope, the kind that can only grow in the absence of everything else. And then, they arrived. It was a place so far from the heart of the galaxy, so far from everything they had known, that it seemed almost unreal. A small colony, nestled on the edge of a barren world, surrounded by the endless stretch of ice and snow. The wind howled through the narrow streets, but the air felt different here. It wasn't the biting, suffocating cold of nocturne, it was the kind of cold that came with stillness, with peace. The colony was small, just a handful of buildings, their walls scarred by the harshness of the world they called home. But there was life here. There was purpose. People moved in quiet rhythm, their steps deliberate but not hurried, their faces worn but not defeated. It was a place that had learned to survive, not in spite of its isolation, but because of it. Saraya looked around, her heart heavy with the weight of what had brought her here, but also light, somehow, with a sense of something new. Something that could be theirs. She could feel it in the air, the promise of something more than just survival. Here, they could begin again. Here, they could build something they could call their own. Darren stood beside her, his presence steady and unyielding. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes was all she needed. They had found it. They had found their place. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, SRA felt the stirring of something she had almost forgotten, belonging. Together, they walked through the streets of the colony, unnoticed by the residents, their existence unremarkable to the world around them. But to SRA, every step felt like a triumph. Every breath felt like a new beginning. They didn't need to announce themselves. They didn't need to make a grand declaration. They simply needed to be here. Together. The colony may have been small, its future uncertain, but it was theirs now. And in that moment, SRA truly knew that this was what they had fought for all along. This was what had made every sacrifice, every struggle, every battle worth it. A home. Not just a place to survive, but a place to live. And in that place, surrounded by the quiet winds of the frozen world, SRA and Darren found what they had longed for, what they had been searching for since they first crossed paths in the storm. Something worth fighting for. Something real. They had built it together. And nothing, not even the Valerie Empire, could take that away from them. Day by day, SRA and Darren lived in the quiet of the small village, where the wind still blew strong, but no longer carried threats. The air here was not just cold in the physical sense, but silent, filled with a stillness that beckoned the peace they had lost so long ago. But the longer they stayed in this quiet place, the more SRA realized that silence was no longer something to fear. It was the peace after the storm, a space to rebuild, to find herself once more. They were no longer the hunted. No longer fleeing from shadows. They moved through each day with purpose, not for survival, but for something greater. They had a future to build, not just for themselves, but for the community they had come to be a part of. Slowly, over time, SRA began to understand that what they had found here, this life, this small but warm existence, was more than enough. It was home. Darren continued his work, fixing broken machinery, restoring what had been lost, while SRA started to teach the younger ones in the village about machines, about how to rebuild, how to repair, how to create not just for survival but for something better. They were no longer just getting by, they were creating, they were building. Together, they were making something real. And then, one day, when the sky began to clear with a rare break in the clouds, SRA and Darren stood by the window, gazing out at the vast, empty world before them. The land was still cold, still barren, but there was something different now. It wasn't just a place to survive, it was a place to live, to thrive. "We don't have to run anymore," SRA said quietly, her voice soft but strong. "We have everything we need. We can live and be free." Darren smiled, looking into her eyes. The answer didn't need to be spoken. They both knew it was true. The freedom they had wasn't from the absence of enemies, it was the freedom they had earned by standing strong together, no longer running from the past but walking toward the future. Because no matter what the world outside might throw at them, one thing was certain: they had found a place to belong. A place where they could build something meaningful, something lasting. They were no longer wanderers. They had found their home. And in that place, amidst the quiet winds of the frozen world, SRA and Darren found what they had longed for, what they had been searching for since they first crossed paths in the storm. Something worth fighting for. Something real. They had built it together. And nothing, not even the Valerie Empire, could take that away from them. What did you think? The adventure never stops here at HFY Galactic Audiobooks. If you enjoyed the ride, don't forget to leave a comment below. Your thoughts are what fuel our next great journey. And if you're craving more jaw-dropping stories from distant galaxies, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to stay up to date with all our latest sci-fi thrillers and alien adventures. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the unknown.